May I speak in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Have you ever tried to describe something difficult? Like, for example, the colour orange. This jar of paprika has got some orange paprika inside it, and it's got a bright orange top. You might like to have a go. Well, perhaps you've got a fighting chance to describe what orange is if someone has seen either red or yellow before. But otherwise, it's very, very difficult without referring to something which is orange. Now imagine trying to describe what orange is to someone who has been blind from birth. Well, good luck with that. You see, how we understand things often depends on having something in common, a common frame of reference, something to compare with. So if I, for example, pick up a teaspoon. Now, imagine that you're showing that to someone in the same room as you, who does not speak your language, doesn't speak English or Welsh. Perhaps this imaginary other person can only speak Japanese or Korean or some language from Borneo, something that you do not have in common and something which you cannot make guesses about. Imagine then you hold up this spoon. What are you saying? Are you referring to this as an item of cutlery? Are you talking about something metallic? Do you want to refer to its shininess? Or perhaps you're offering them a dessert? 4 or 5 different possibilities just off the top of my head from looking at a spoon. Not easy to make any sort of connection there without a common frame of reference. So, how do you think Jesus of Nazareth is going to cope with the abstract concept of initiating growth in the kingdom of heaven when they don't know what the kingdom of heaven is or how to grow it? Well, we think we're pretty smart, don't we, in this century? But are we really that much more advanced than them, the people of those times? Well, even the wisdom of Solomon is needed to try and describe a difficult concept such as growth in the kingdom of heaven. Humans of the past, the present, and the future will always lack that frame of reference that makes complete understanding of the concept of the kingdom of heaven possible. But thank goodness these days, because of Jesus and because of the people who have followed in his footsteps, we have a greater understanding. But we will always need to be told the kingdom of heaven is a bit like such and such, because a direct, literal comparison is often useless. So the author of Matthew has compiled many of Jesus' teachings on the subject of the kingdom of heaven, and he presents them to us in our Bible reading this morning. He gives us an overview of the many different attempts Jesus made to get the message across about what is the kingdom of heaven and how can it be brought about, how can it grow. Although Jesus may have used imagery and words that got the message across to the people on the highways and the byways of the Holy Land, in fact, it is just as useful, his words are just as useful to the people out there who are, I don't know, this afternoon buying chips, the new chip shop in Penarth Pier, or the people of Kuala Lumpur, not just now, but in 200 years' time. The words are great and we should listen to them. We need to listen to them carefully, however, to make sure that we understand. Now, with Matthew's reading this morning, the usual explanation from the author of Matthew is considered to be along the lines of, from small beginnings, great things grow. And that's brilliant. And so we have the account then of this mustard seed. Now, mustard seeds are not the smallest seeds in the world. I know that if you read the Bible passage literally, that's what would be said. They are just, in fact, the smallest seeds that those people on the roadside there talking to Jesus would have ever encountered. They're about 1 to 2 millimeters long, these mustard seeds. There are 3 or 4 different species of mustard in the world that he could have been referring to, but black mustard, Brassica nigra, can grow to about 9 feet. I think that's 2.3 meters. 9 feet up into the air from these tiny, tiny little seeds. So the meaning is clear. From these tiny, tiny little seeds, these tiny, tiny little embryos, great things can spring up. It's quite tempting for me as a vicar to add, great things can spring up if they're properly nurtured, because that does sound like a genuine improvement and it's usually needed. But Jesus in this passage, doesn't actually say that. Going by exactly what he said, he does not mention that here. Has he missed a trick? Well, no, not on closer inspection, because this is the first time of mentioning it to many of these people. Whilst he could have chosen many species of trees as his example in this parable, because they are much larger than mustard shrubs, and some of them do have seeds which are very, very small. Jesus specifically mentions mustard. And the question is why, if it's not the biggest plant around and it's not got the smallest seeds in existence? Well, whilst mustard does illustrate something growing seemingly exponentially from tiny beginnings to become a massive, significant feature on the face of the world, actually, I think mustard has another property, which most people like me in pulpits don't generally talk about, which is important and which is why Jesus chose it for his example. The fact is that whilst the mustard plant, can be very useful for the spice that it produces, making mustard obviously, or for its oil, it's also something else. The fact of the matter is, this plant is a bloody nuisance. This plant is not something that you place delicately into a little terracotta pot and water gently with your miniature watering can, and you put it in a lovely place and you go and check on it every single day, hoping for it to grow. It's just not that sort of plant. This plant is a monster, a vigorous growing monster. In fact, this plant is incredibly notorious for self-seeding all over the place and taking over. So if you planted it in a garden, you would have much of a garden there within a shorter period of time. So the notion that someone would delicately plant it in their garden or anywhere near their main crop, if they were farmers, would have had Jesus' audience just laughing out loud about it. The people of the Holy Land 2,000 years ago may not be as sophisticated as us in some ways, but they knew a great deal more than us on some topics. Jesus happily continues the metaphor of the enormous size of the mustard shrubs by exaggeratedly claiming that birds of the air landed in its branches, or could land in its branches. And he may even have been pointing up to some, I don't know, a great vulture or something circling up in the air at the time, so that he and the other people in his audience, as it were, could have a good laugh about it. Interestingly, of course, in the same passage, Jesus takes it even further. So once he's finished with mustard seeds, he moves on to something else. And this time he does the same with yeasts. Great loaves of bread are possible because of the action of these microscopic yeasts, causing the dough to rise to many, many times its original size in the hot sun of the Holy Land during the proving process. I think it's fascinating that Jesus talks about something which extends his argument even further, the yeast, without his audience ever knowing what a yeast was. And in fact, no one would know what yeast were until 16 centuries later with the development of microscopes. So I think that's very interesting that Jesus was able to take the abstract concept, make it accessible to all the people in the audience, but also make it accessible to the people of centuries later who knew what yeast were because microscopes had then been invented. So in some way, Jesus was talking to his present day audience and to audiences of the future all at once. Yeasts, microscopic creatures, too small to be seen, which extend his metaphor going from something tiny to something 10,000, 100,000 times larger as a result of their action. But now onto another bit that people have missed quite often over the centuries. We've said that the mustard plant is a vigorous weed outside of a field where it's grown particularly because its tiny little windspread seeds would just get everywhere. And they self-seed and they grow quickly wherever they land. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this choice of the mustard plant was made by Jesus in his illustration. A plant that grows absolutely everywhere, a nuisance, a weed, something incredibly vigorous, because it will grow in fields, it will grow in roadside verges, it will grow on rocky ground, it will grow literally everywhere. And actually, that reminds us that last week, and if you're reading it out just a few breaths before, Jesus was talking about another parable, the parable of the sower, and how different seeds landed in different places. And it's talked about how they grew in all the places because of the bounty of the sower who decided to sow the seeds absolutely everywhere. So when distributed by God the sower, these vigorous seeds will get everywhere. The seeds of the mustard plant will get everywhere and will thrive. So this parable is an extension of last week's parable, the parable of the sower. Then we talked about the sower. Today we're talking about the seeds, which are vigorous and will grow just about anywhere. As with the parable of the unleavened bread, the leavening agents, the microscopic yeasts, well, they are absolutely everywhere too, on the surface of grapes, on your hands, every living surface. There are these microscopic little creatures. Of course, they weren't seen for 17 centuries after Jesus told this parable, and there was the advent of the first microscope. But they too are an extension, if you like, of the parable of the sower from last week. They get everywhere, they thrive, they produce an enormous effect disproportionate to their size. So the agents for carrying out wonderful transformations, either of the view ahead in front of you or carrying out the bread making process, whatever they are, these agents for carrying out the change, the tiny little seeds or the microscopic yeasts, are waiting there for the right conditions to initiate startling growth and startling change. Well, last week we talked about the sower who didn't seemingly care where the seed went. The important thing was that he sowed absolutely everywhere. And that's because a great harvest was produced. And it was important, in fact, that the less favoured places were sown with seed. This week, the emphasis has been on the almost invisible seeds or the completely invisible yeasts, who then go on to produce enormous growth and have an enormous effect. Now, we could talk about nurturing those things, the mustard plants or the yeasts, in order for them to achieve their best effect, in order for them to grow and do what they must do. But actually, this isn't about nurturing in that sense. When conditions weren't perfect, these organisms struggled on and grew because it was their nature to do so. And it was their nature to thrive, producing the next generation as they did so. Of course, we could make their life easier by talking about the nurturing process, and that's what most vicars would like to do when talking about churches and how to get them to grow. But that's beyond in this sermon, beyond the concept for this week. Here, we just move to the conclusion and say, Jesus is telling us not to be anxious in difficult times. He's saying that we should try to work with God's plan to the best of our ability. But at the end of the day, it is God's plan, and it will succeed always. We can help it along by improving the conditions for growth, but actually it will always succeed. God's church has a mission. It will accomplish that mission. Individual churches, individual seeds may not be successful, but the overall plan will be accomplished. And actually, that's good news, because for us as Christians, it means that we need fear absolutely nothing. Amen. Well, it's been lovely talking to you this morning, and I hope to see you again soon. There isn't a sermon next week because I'm on leave, but I will hope to see you very soon. Bye for now.